Okay, good morning and welcome to the Soy Advisor webinar, Cover Crops and Spring Management, brought to you by the Illinois Soybean Checkoff Program. My name is Claire Weinzerl. I'm Communications Manager for the Illinois Soybean Association, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us this morning, and I have just a few housekeeping items to begin with. If you included your CCA number when you registered for the webinar and you stay with us for the entire presentation, your number will be automatically submitted for one CEU in soil and water management at the conclusion of the webinar. And if you're listening to a recording of this webinar, you'll need to go to the Certified Crop Advisor website, log into your account, and self-report for credit. You can also ask questions during today's webinar by using the tools panel at the bottom of your screen, and we will have some time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. But without further delay, I'd like to introduce today's presenters, Abigail Peterson and Jim Iserman. A certified crop advisor, Abigail Peterson earned a Bachelor of Science in Agronomy from Iowa State University. As Director of Agronomy at the Illinois Soybean Association, Peterson helps guide ISA conservation efforts and aids in the development and implementation of conservation ag research and outreach programs. She also helps lead the demonstration and adoption of conservation ag practices for Illinois' 43,000 soybean farmers. Jim Iserman serves as the Soil Health Specialist for the Illinois Sustainable Ag Partnership. He graduated from the University of Illinois in 2002 with a bachelor's degree in crop sciences and returned home to work on the family farm with his father. He has experience working with cover crops in his previous roles with the Soil Health Partnership and as a seed dealer, as well as utilizing annuals and other forages in grazing systems. He currently has a 65-head cow-calf operation. The farm includes 900 acres in Livingston and LaSalle counties with 120 acres in permanent forage and the rest in a corn-soy rotation. And with that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you, Abigail and Jim.
Thanks, Claire, and thanks everyone for joining us today. We have a lot to cover, so we are jumping straight into our cover crop spring management portion, which we know there's a lot of information when it comes to cover crops, and especially when we're coming to planting in the spring. So we could talk all day about this. We really narrowed it down to the top key considerations you need to be making. We would love to talk about IPM all day long. But essentially, if you come away with these key concepts, hopefully it will help you make some of those decisions in the spring, and you'll have some of the principles behind why you're making those decisions. And so really kicking it off with application methods and fall establishment. We see a lot of different application methods throughout Illinois, and it really does kind of put you ahead of the game, or we see different rates of fall establishment, which can really affect what your spring management will be. And that will lead into our discussion on biomass, which you really need to understand, leading into termination, the biggest one, I would think, in terms of looking into spring management, and then your nitrogen management, which in these systems, cover crops and no-till, needs to be considered. And then at the end, hopefully tying it all together and all the concepts complementing each other into planting considerations. And so I put a note of time at the bottom here because we have a lot to cover, and I know there's going to be more. So please ask questions in the chat, ask questions after this webinar, and follow us on our platforms, and hopefully we can answer all what you need.
So I'm just going to take a minute to put a little context to what we're going to talk about today. So when you hear some of the recommendations or thoughts that we have, understanding that these are largely observational. They're as a result of us working with a lot of growers throughout the last few years throughout the state of Illinois, as well as in Wisconsin and Missouri a little bit through some of the other programs. But we're really trying to key in on the agronomics, how to make these systems successful. So first of all, thank you to all the farmers that have been involved with these programs over the years and allowing us to work with them, and their willingness to take some risks and at least understanding the systems for themselves, and then being willing to help other farmers to learn the system so that they can avoid some of the pitfalls that they've had while realizing some of the benefits from soil health. The programs themselves, as was mentioned by Claire, I worked with the Soil Health Partnership along with Abigail. We were field managers in Illinois. So we worked with a number of growers through that program, and now we're continuing that through Illinois Corn and Illinois Soy's Precision Conservation Management Program. Within PCM, a lot of this information will come specifically from what's called a 5-year transition program, which began back in 2019, where we work with a lot of growers who are starting off with cover crops. They're trying to learn the system. They're wanting to have some close one-on-one support So we try to work with them in order to make sure that they're doing the best they can to adopt to these practices. But they're looking at side-by-side comparisons. So you'll see a lot of those pictures involved here where there's a comparison of a cover crop versus a non-cover crop, which gives us a lot of advantage to really see what the effect is of the cover crop. We're excited because we had 54 plots seeded in the fall of 2021 within that program. So it's going to give us a lot to look at this coming spring. But we definitely want to make sure that we're appreciative of those programs that we've been involved in. There's a lot of support through the NRCS as well for that 5YT program through an on-farm SIG. Lastly, just to kind of make note that most of the fields that we're working with are in commodity agriculture. They're corn and soybean systems. A lot of cool things going on in ag today, whether it's organic, whether it's regenerative systems. And all that can really tie to your goals, and any recommendations that we're going to give. If you're ever going to work with a farmer or talk through best ways to adopt a cover crops, you really have to recognize what the end goal is. So for us, keep in mind that when we talk through recommendations, maybe you've heard something different, maybe you've heard something a little, not quite in line with some of the things that we're saying. Just keep in mind that we are working primarily with corn and soybean systems. They're usually high yielding areas of the state. And, our goal is certainly we want them to have a positive experience with cover crops so they can realize the soil health benefits, the yield or the environmental benefits, the yield benefits. At the same time, we want to avoid having any potential negative issues, which is what we're going to talk a lot about today in terms of spring management, is how do we maximize the potential of the cover crop while minimizing any potential adverse effects.
And so kicking it off with applications and fall establishment, like Jim said, we've worked with cover crop fields throughout Illinois for a number of years. And so we do start to see some trends and what makes a difference. If you can get out there a week earlier, does that really make a difference in your establishment in the fall and then leading up to the spring? And then just what type of applications can really be worth the time to utilize to get in. So here we'll talk about application methods, row spacing and goals we want to accomplish, something that's really cool to look at and farmers are really playing around with. And then some fall 2022 establishment notes that we took. We had a great fall for plots to go in. So we'll luckily have a great spring to be able to look at a lot of fields. And so a lot of my slides are very busy because I want to cover so much, but I have such a short amount of time. So these are a lot of the interseeding, overseeding, cover crop applications we see. We've seen them put on other passes in the field, so you're eliminating multiple passes throughout the field. Definitely, Jim had a lot of experience with the interseeding in Wisconsin, being northern. We always said, if they can do it, we can do it down here. So it was very interesting how they would approach trying to get in early in those fields, looking something using a Haggy system, aerial applications, and then even putting it on the combine, which I know is not going to be the most preferable when you're combining in the fall to take a break and either fill up or the combine header already has enough problems as it is. You don't need to add something else, but it is very interesting to start to see how to get in earlier, and that eliminates time and labor after the fact of harvest. So these are really great ways that we're seeing in Illinois of getting the cover crop in early, and Jim will go in later in the presentation of why those different species need to get a better establishment early in the season. And so now moving probably to the most commonly used, a drill. Drills are used, you can even rent one from your local SWCD office, essentially getting the best seed to soil contact, really getting great ground coverage, surface areas covered. We've seen drills that farmers even have used to plug up rows. So you're utilizing the spaces in between, keeping your cash crop row clean and less, keeping the seed bed for that perfect, which I'll show you photos later here. Using a 15-foot drill at 5 miles an hour is slow, takes time. There are drills that are larger, but drills have pros and cons. I even have the red drill at the bottom there, older model, but essentially that one has a 15-inch row spacing. And so drills are used all across the board in many different ways, but we know that farmers need to get across ground fast. And so here are a couple of methods that we're seeing, using that air seeder along with a light vertical or light tillage implement to really get that seed incorporation very lightly. Has shown great establishment and can get you across a couple acres, you know, seen it on strip till bars, or at least utilizing a strip till method. And then even using your planter, a 15-inch row or 30-inch row planter. You can see some of the seed plates below using a wheat seed plate or special small seeded plate. Seed right plates now have a lot of different options for a lot of different models. But essentially the planter is also a great option, which again, might not be for you if you're not wanting to pull out that planter at the busy time of harvest, but if you're prepared and this is the method that you want to go, it definitely has a lot of benefits that you can see in the long run, and something that you already have sitting around that you can utilize. So a lot of different application methods. And like I said, being able to utilize that row space has been really interesting and fun to watch farmers play around with. So you can see on the left-hand side in the top, that's where the farmer used that 7.5-inch row drill and plugged up the cash crop row and really allowed that seed bed to be available for when you plant that cash crop. It's like planting more into a no-till. You're not intimidated by a really high biomass or situation where if your cover crop did get over exceeding growth than you expected, you're given a lot of flexibility. And this was a great example. Those photos in Altamont were taken in 2019, where the farmer did want to get in and terminate early, but ended up having to delay because of spring wet weather. But really that row spacing led him to be able to be flexible and be able to accommodate for that situation. You can see now more in the upper right-hand corner, we have the 15-inch row spacing. I really like to see this on fields. Like Jim said, we work especially in fields in central Illinois where there is a lot of flat ground where you do though see in-field erosion, but essentially not that really sloping ground. So using something like a 15-inch row is a great option. It gets great ground coverage, but again, leading to better cash crop establishment, especially when we want to plant earlier and get those beans out of the ground faster. So in the lower corner, you can see that's even going further into a 30-inch row situation. Again, that was a 2019 field where that's barley headed out. Barley got to about waist high on me. So it was a great situation where it was wanting to get terminated a little earlier, but you know, being able to let it go and be able to take the rainfall impacts and let the ground stay intact and not have to worry about termination too much was ideal. And he actually goes in with his planter and in the 15-inch row spacing has winter kills that complements a corn system that he'll be planting in that field. And then the Ivesdale field below is a great option of what we can look at row spacing wise when we're trying to utilize corn into the rotation, which Jim will go into some more details on that. So this is a busy slide, but essentially it's taking into the consideration of where you are at harvest. We know harvest, when you hear ideal planting dates, it's usually mid to late September, but that is not always ideal for getting actually in the field, having the labor, having the tractor available to get across. And so looking at aerial seeding as that first picture is a great option. You do need to have a lot of it's more adverse to the weather. So, you know, you want to have moisture in the ground and you want to have a rain soon after to get good establishment, but it is worth a try if you're looking into getting in earlier and getting some rooting depth on that cover crop. It can make a difference. But the drill can be tried and true. And then that last photo there in Moweaqua was a broadcasted field by the co-op and then lightly incorporated in by the farmer. So we see a lot of that too, where it either goes on with the dry fertilizer and gets a light incorporation. We usually encourage some type of incorporations if it's broadcasted. In all these situations too, you're changing the rate and population of the cover crop to accommodate the application method. Which really accomplishes the goals at the bottom there. So, you know, your goals is biodiversity. You're going to have to get in earlier. You're going to have to consider how you're going to accommodate it, either using early maturity cash crops or just making sure that if that's your goal, if that's the seed that you have on hand, that you're getting it in the ground. Or if you're trying to get ground coverage, using something like a drill to get better seed to soil contact, using the air seeder, something that can get very good surface area accommodated. Or if you're that Palmyra field that I had was starting to be long-term no-till cover crops and really just getting biomass out there. This was along the river, so you know, wasn't always ideal to get a cover crop in. So doing something like broadcasting and land incorporation, you can see, hopefully we would get a lot of tillers out of that as well. So we do look at tillering as we're doing stand counts, and hopefully as you get your cover crop in, you can see some tillering as well if you're getting in earlier. And so going into cover crop establishment and planting this fall, we had a lot of great fields. And here's an example of strip till fields that we had. Strip till being a great option with cover crops. On the left-hand side, those will be going into corn. You can see down in Bunker Hill, more south central Illinois. That picture was taken on November 17th. He got planted on October 5th. So some really great growth, really great establishment. Strip tilled after the cover crop was planted. The New Berlin field, we'll have to see if that gets some good growth. And then the field in Putnam, Illinois, is going to be rotated into soybeans, which is an interesting approach, seeing more strip till soybeans, especially, you know, even if you've done the past before, but now being utilized in cover crop systems. As we're looking at early soybean planting dates, can a strip till approach get us in, get those beans planted early and popped up out of the ground when we need them to be, but still being able to utilize that space in the rows for a cover crop. And you can see, we see a lot of strip till throughout the state and a lot of different types of strip till bars. So it's really neat to see, you know, how the soil, the crumble, even looking at crumble of strip till or and how those mellow out in the spring has been really interesting. Here's examples of fields this fall. You can see this one's in Bloomington. The picture of the example is actually on Jim's operation of using the Haggie. That's just shown because that's how this field was planted into the corn. It was used a ground rig on September 1st. So as you see radishes and cereal rye in that picture there, they got early establishment, was really great in what you need to do, especially with the radishes. So example there, this is a picture of Champaign, Illinois, and 15-inch row cereal rye on November 9th. This is a planted field on October 2nd of oats near Palmer, Illinois. This was picture taken on November 2nd. A great example of if you're using oats as a winter kill, to get it in planted late September, early October, this is where you see the growth make a difference for you in getting some biomass. If you got it in too late, luckily oats do get out of the ground a little bit faster, but getting it much past into late October, not worth the time to really have it just die out in the winter. Here's an example of down in Moweaqua, we had a field that was broadcasted by the co-op, Lightly Incorporated, and this will be a trial in its first year. And so doing the rotation before soybeans with cereal rye, keeping into consideration that this farmer is usually in a system of very high conventional tillage, so either 1 to 2 passes before soybeans. So this will be a very interesting adaptation, and something that we really encourage on our plots is when we're looking at establishment, looking at now going into the spring, we want to change the management as far as planting depth or looking at when we're going to terminate that cover crop. We want them to accommodate the cover crop system, which is going to be different than your tillage side. So we want the best approach for the cover crop to succeed. Here's an example of an aerial seeded field. Jim and I had, in the program, a lot of aerial seeded fields this year. Those can be hit and miss. Really getting into the practice, if you have an experienced flyer who knows when good fly dates are, knowing when you have moisture in the ground and will have a rain after. As you can see here, this one was near Bloomington, Illinois. It was flown on October 7th. It had a rain right after that of around an inch. He did about 48 pounds. So this will be an interesting, one of the better establishments I've seen with aerial seeding into soybean residue, which soybean versus corn residue, or standing corn versus standing soybeans is also something that we're comparing, and it can be a challenge to get into soybeans. So this was a good example of aerial seeding, and hopefully we'll have a lot of good examples this year and good fields to look at. And so from all of those pictures of looking at fall establishment, Jim's gonna jump into why looking into biomass is so important when we're talking about spring management.
Yeah, so that may have seemed like a kind of a quick run through, and obviously the point of this webinar is the spring management side of things. But as we talk through the important things with spring management, we have to recognize what's going on in the fall and how that relates to what we're trying to gain in the springtime. So those different application methods are certainly going to show up in our continuing discussion here. Keep in mind we're not going too much into specifics about species, varieties, anything like that. I think you're definitely going to pick up on the theme that we're going to talk a lot about cereal rye and also a number of other cereals, because those tend to be the ones that are most winter hardy. There are things that can go in our cash corn and soybean systems and give us good overwintering success. I think we're also going to kind of see that difference between what is the ideal versus what can we get done and what can we get accomplished. We hit on that idea of the drill being kind of that ideal, maybe to get that good solid stand. Maybe it depends on what your goal is, but then there's all these other kinds of options out there in order to get those cover crops established. We're going to talk a lot about that too when we get to spring management. There may be that ideal, and then there's sometimes those things that we have to do in order to deal with the specifics of the year, or maybe we're trying a new system. We're going to try to kind of give some alternatives when we talk to things about nitrogen management. We recognize that, maybe you're not going to go out in that first year and add a bunch of attachments to your planter for nitrogen. So we're going to kind of talk over some of those alternatives that may help you get by on a small scale while also trying to identify what is probably the best way to do that. A lot of this is going to tie back to biomass. So we're going to spend a pretty good amount of time on this. As I said, we're talking, commodity corn soybean systems. Abigail mentioned seeing so many people moving to earlier planting soybeans, or even talking about planting corn. Biomass is a big part of how we manage things in the springtime, and it is both a benefit and a potential concern that we have. Obviously, we want some biomass in order to get the benefits out of cover crops, but we need to balance that with some of the potential issues we can have with that. So we're going to talk a lot actually about how these different materials can break down, how we can make sure that we're terminating it at the right time. And we're going to try to talk a little bit about species as well as what the balance is in order to get that good balance between when to terminate and when to get more biomass. So first of all, there's probably two main goals when we talk about the biomass. First of all, we're going to talk about protecting the soil. We're going to maybe talk about weed control as well. And those are kind of some things that we need to have that higher biomass side of things. We're going to talk a lot about feeding the soil. And I think everybody's heard this idea too, that we're trying to charge the microbes in the soil. We're trying to keep things going in the soil to bring back that soil health. And when we talk about feeding our soil, we like to think about it a lot like feeding livestock. So if you've got cattle, you've got any type of livestock, we're often talking about the quality of the feed, and we want to talk about that with our biomass. So we're going to talk a lot about carbon to nitrogen ratio. This is a simple way of really just making a very basic comparison of how much carbon versus how much nitrogen. It's going to be tied very much to the growth stage with most of our crops. And our cover crops, it's also going to vary a lot by the amount of growth. So we're gonna talk a lot about cereal rye because it's the most commonly used cover crop. So you'll see that as we go through these following slides. But it's also going to vary a lot, obviously, if you have something like a legume in there instead of a grass or even a brassica. But there's kind of an area around 24:1 is kind of the magic number when we talk about carbon to nitrogen ratios. And why we think about that being the good balance is because that's when it's going to both give us good biomass and yet at the same time break down fairly easily that year. So it's going to return a lot of those nutrients that it's collected over the course of the year while feeding the microbes. If we go too much higher than that, what we find is the residue can be very slow to break down. And this can cause some issues, particularly in something like a corn system. Again, that applies mostly to cereal rye. If we're looking at legumes, maybe they'll break down a little bit quicker. But if it's a soybean system, that may be a little bit less of a concern. So we're going to find that there's a huge difference between what our cash crop is, whether it's corn or soybeans, versus what our cover crop is. So we're always trying to think through what are we planting and what are we planting into. If we're doing a grass into a grass, that's entirely different than doing a legume into a grass. So when we think about our carbon to nitrogen ratios, when we think about that corn going into cereal rye, it's a much bigger deal than if we're talking about planting soybeans into a cereal rye cover crop. But we will cover kind of the situation for both of those. So as we look at the mixes that we have out there and the different types of species, having things like legumes help us kind of balance that carbon to nitrogen ratio. When we can have those out there with some of the cereal rye or other species that are out there, and we can help to find those balances. So we're going to have a number of charts here that have these different carbon to nitrogen ratios. So just to give you the context of where things typically are, we're pretty used to things like corn stover, oat straw, wheat straw. Those are that 57-to-1 or higher. We all know the corn stover can hang out over the winter time and still be there come the springtime. There can be a number of reasons for this, but part of that is because it has that higher to carbon to nitrogen ratio. When we're thinking about this in terms of the diet, think of that nitrogen component as the protein component, going back to the livestock feed side of things. So this is that trade-off between tonnage, having more and more, and we'll see that with the cereal rye versus having that quality. As we look at the alfalfas and having those legumes, we see how we get those carbon to nitrogen ratios down. So if we go to the next slides, we'll start to see some of these differences. Take note that cereal rye is in here multiple times because we want to document that it's not a static thing. The carbon to nitrogen ratio changes, and it changes very quickly in cereal rye. So at the vegetative stage, we're seeing cereal rye at 26-to-1, which is still a very good ratio to get good breakdown. So this is going to be kind of analogous, I would say, in that 18 to 24 inch range as far as height. Obviously, it's more about crop stage than height, but I think we'll give you just a general idea. That's what we're talking about when we're hitting that 26-to-1 kind of balance. For me, that's when I like to terminate, and we'll come back to that in a little bit, but that's we're trying to capture it at that kind of ideal stage of carbon to nitrogen ratio. If we go to the next slide, I think we get them spread out more when we see the higher ratios, when we see how that rye straw. So when we start seeing those pictures of those farms that are 6-foot tall cereal rye, we're actually looking at an 82-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio, which is well beyond something like corn stalk. So we need to keep these things in mind as we think through how we want to manage our cover crops in the springtime. So rye, even at anthesis, anthesis is an important point for cereal rye, because if we're going to talk about roller crimping, for example, we want to wait till anthesis. So anthesis is when the rye is flowering, but even at anthesis, we can be keeping that cereal rye to that 37-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio, versus if we let it go beyond that, we really push it up to that 82-to-1. So keep this in mind as we talk about this, and you can see how those other cover crop species, the radishes, the clovers, how they help to keep that down, and they can help to keep it down even in a mix as well, because you're not having all that biomass that is higher up. There are different grasses. So we're going to talk about cereal rye, but there's a whole family of cereals out there. There's things like barley, wheat, triticale are some of the other three popular ones. We've seen a lot of barley being used lately in the last few years, particularly ahead of corn. So if we're talking about cereal rye, if we're in the planting process, cereal rye ahead of corn is probably where we see the majority of our cover crop issues. So if you're just starting off, we want to make sure that you probably consider trying a different cover crop ahead of corn for the first few years. The only times that we really like to see cereal rye ahead of corn used is when a grower is prepared to manage it. And we're going to talk a lot about that when we get to the nitrogen management. Or if they're in a highly erodible situation or a low yield situation, then we might see something like cereal rye giving some value to be used ahead of corn. Otherwise, we really want to look at it mostly ahead of soybeans. And if we really need something, a cereal that can overwinter better, we're looking at things such as, probably barley and triticale being our next two choices to have, because they just simply do not take off growing as quickly in the springtime. We get a wider window to capture them in that appropriate carbon to nitrogen ratio, and they just don't end up with as much biomass at the end of the day. So when we have an issue such as 2019, which we're going to talk a little bit about some of the issues that we had there, where we had those really late planting dates, we don't have as much biomass to be concerned about, especially ahead of corn planting. We are also going to mention annual ryegrass, and we always want to make sure that we're differentiating between annual ryegrass and cereal rye. Annual ryegrass is a tremendous cover crop. It has a lot of very good benefits for the soil, but it is something that is a little bit harder to get established. It is much harder to make sure that you're getting it killed properly when we talk about termination. But a head of corn, if you can manage it properly, it can be better than a lot of these cereal options because it tends to have a lower carbon to nitrogen ratio. The other grasses that we talk about are primarily cereals. They can be harvested for grain. That's where we're kind of bringing them over to the cover crop side, whereas annual ryegrass is more of a turf type, more of a forage type grass. So it is much higher quality as far as the protein content, maintains that carbon to nitrogen ratio. So it will have a lot less biomass, but it does take another level of management in order to make sure that you're being able to get it established and to get it terminated properly. So annual ryegrass is a lot of the early work that was done with cover crops, a lot of the positives in terms of building soil tests and things like that. A lot of the things in Southern Illinois that we see nowadays with the frangipans and everything, a lot of that is tied to annual ryegrass. But again, just making sure that we're differentiating that between the cereal rye that we see in most of the fields and most of the images that we're showing.
So this is just an example of what we see as far as mixes, keeping it simple. You might hear a lot of talk about 16-way mixes or higher, which is great, but essentially looking at mixes that are practical and will hopefully overwinter in Illinois. That's the hard thing, is to get something in early and that will overwinter. So here we have an example of barley, oats, rape, and crimson clover. Really using those oats as a buffer. Those will get out of the ground quicker and establish and help protect and buffer those smaller seeded rapeseed and crimson clover. And then the oats die. The barley will hopefully overwinter. So this is an example in Ivesdale that we had that had a good example of corn into the system. And essentially, this is an example of what the field looked like on December 15th. So this was planted early October, mid-October. And so got good spring growth, which was important. And so something to note that, it wasn't in super early, but definitely got good growth. And this is one of the fields. This is now March 24th, same field. And we're looking, this is our side-by-side photo, essentially looking at the approach of that row, utilizing the row spacing. So we're making sure we're not intimidating that where the corn will be planted, and really utilizing, though, keep trying to get something green on this field, being able to capture sunlight and be able to keep those microbes stimulated throughout the year. So it's a really great approach before corn. Here we're now into April, and the field was planted, and that roll down of the mat of rye you can see there was just from running it over. It was in the vegetative stage still. It just probably got to roughly, it was below 12 inches of that rye. And then it did overwinter some of those clovers, but essentially just a great balance of the whole system from start to finish of how you can try to maximize the soil health benefits with keeping the biomass manageable and making sure that you're understanding we're in a corn system now. And so we don't want to push it too much. Something like soybeans can be pushed a little further, but with the corn, really keeping it simple and making sure, this is about as far as we wanted to go with the biomass. And so, and then this got really great, they terminated very soon at day of, I think, and it got really great residue turnover throughout the year. And so what we also see as we talk about biomass and why we're using the cover crops, and especially in what rotation we're in, is because also weed control is being a really good tool that cover crops can be used. And these are just examples throughout the state. I've got Gillespie and Auburn here, and you can see water hemp even being one where I will say, I've seen fields where it's brought down the population of water hemp, but really also just bringing down the intensity of it's not getting established as early as in the control. And so you're getting better usage out of your herbicides when they can attack that water hemp on the labeled recommendation, than really having that water hemp get out of control and get high up and having to really rely on the herbicide to do the majority of the work. So using cover crops for weed control is really making sure that, you're putting out a higher population. Using something like cereal rye has been shown to be successful. You can see henbit as one. Sometimes we see fields, in the spring, there's always like the weed of the year, and yellow rocket was one year. And I had a lot of people asking if that yellow rocket was a cover crop. And No, but in my cover crop fields, you definitely saw suppression, especially of those vibrant weeds, like something like hembit or yellow rocket. But mare's tail, water hemp, those, it's interesting when we're starting to see the biomass to be used of the cover crop to combat weeds. But essentially, if that's your goal, we're trying to use that goal throughout the season and for spring management when we get there.
Yeah, so your pictures, I think there's kind of two different things that go on when we talk about controlling the weeds. And you can see in these pictures where we don't have that massive biomass necessarily, but that plant is just out there competing, right? So it's keeping the mare's tail down. We also see, huge benefits with the winter annuals, obviously. And one of the first things, as far as an economic side of things, if a grower is doing things like a fall burn down, we can see cover crops replace fall burn downs very quickly within a year or two, just because the plant is out there. So beyond talking about those high biomass situations, just having that living green plant out there throughout the winter into the spring is going to give us some benefits. But then we're going to go on to talk about, okay, those guys that are really looking to get a lot of weed control benefits out of it, that's when they're going to start to maximize the growth of something like cereal rye. That's when they're going to let it get to those higher carbon to nitrogen ratios, because their goal is to knock it down, and usually using like the roller Crimper, which we're going to discuss here in a minute, to get that high biomass. So again, that's why it's important. What is your goal? What are you trying to get out of this? If weed control is something you're really after, you can get kind of both effects. You get the effect of just a living green plant out there in the springtime out competing, but then sometimes we also push it to where you get that high biomass, high carbon to nitrogen ratio crop out there that will persist and stay out there for most of the season, keeping it down. So I think we're going to go and start talking about termination then. And we're going to talk a little bit about chemical termination as well as using a roller Crimper. We're also going to talk a little bit about using just a regular roller outside of termination. So that'll be something, I know it's kind of a little difficult when we have this discussion to keep those two things clear. So hopefully we'll do a good job when we get to it. But by and large, the growers that we work with are going to be looking at using chemical terminations for their cover crops. So generally speaking, we're going to be kind of hitting the high notes, assuming a cereal rye or other cereal cover crop. And then we'll also talk about a little bit of, if you have some of those other species out there, some of the steps that you need to be taking. But the main points to be concerned about when we talk about going out there in the springtime and wanting to get your cover crop terminated is making sure that we're avoiding some things such as like a nitrogen carrier. So we're assuming, guys going out there in this situation would be ahead of a corn crop, right? So if you have a cereal out there, if you have a cereal rye or an annual rye grass, we're going to be looking primarily at using glyphosate for those cereal and grass cover crops. So when we are using glyphosate, we need to make sure that we're getting really good absorption and that we're getting that chemical into the plant to get it killed. So we want to be careful using something like a nitrogen carrier. So I know it's pretty common if your guy is using a weed and feed application, using something like 28% or 32%. But we need to be careful because those can cause leaf burn to the tissue of the plant that we're trying to kill. It can make that glyphosate not go in as well. Leaf burn can also be a concern with some of the contact herbicides that we have. So again, if we're relying on that glyphosate, we want to make sure that we're not adding something, that would cause significant amount of leaf burn and prohibit that glyphosate from getting in. We want warm temperatures, and hopefully everybody understands this when we're working with glyphosate, but it needs those warm temperatures to be active. We need to understand that this is not the same as doing an application in a no-till situation. When we have straight no-till and you're just going out there and trying to clean up and pick up some of those winter annuals, this is very different if you're going out there and trying to kill a solid stand of cereal rye or a cereal cover crop of some sort. So make sure that it's actively growing. Make sure that you have good new tissue. We have a picture in here somewhere from the spring already where we've seen, some of that frost damage. We have brown leaf tissue on top of the cereal rye that's starting to come out of dormancy. We need to make sure that tissue is kind of been outgrown, right? We need good, healthy green tissue for the cereal rye or any cereal to take in that glyphosate. Some of the tank mixes that we see some issues with, again, this is primarily with glyphosate. So atrazine is very common to be used ahead of corn. And metribuzin is a herbicide that we see used commonly ahead of soybeans. But those two herbicides can cause an antagonism with glyphosate. I've been told, I'm not a herbicide expert, but my understanding is that they have a clay carrier involved in them somehow. So that clay binds with the glyphosate and makes it not work as effectively. If we're going after something like cereal rye, for the most part, it may work, it may not. I need to really stress, if you have an annual ryegrass out there that you're trying to control, you really need to avoid these tank mixes that are out there. Metribuzin is a little tricky because it is in a lot of tank mixes, pre-mixes. So you may be using something that has 2 to 3 modes of action that may have that in there. And so you need to kind of watch that. So when we do run into issues with a failed termination or some problems with cereal rye, it is usually, you can usually trace it back to having some of these in the mix as well. So we need to watch that. There's nothing wrong necessarily with using these herbicides in the system. It is just when they are applied with glyphosate, they can cause some problems with getting good activity. In addition to that, we do see this year with glyphosate being a little bit maybe tighter. There's some more interest in using something else. What else can we use besides glyphosate? I know some growers will be using something like clethodim, which can be has been used in the past for good burn down. Obviously we need to be very careful if we're using something like that ahead of corn. Always read your labels, always consult with a herbicide rep from the company that can give you all the insights on how to use that. If you have broadleafs out there besides the cereals, if we're looking at the cereals and the grasses, glyphosate's your best bet. If you have a legume or maybe a brassica that is overwintering, you need to add something for broadleaf control, something like a 2,4-D or anything that can take care of those broadleaf. Sharpen is another one. We don't see too many issues with tank mixing those. 2,4-D and glyphosate works very well as far as a spring dirt burn down goes, as long as it's compatible with your cash crop. Talk to somebody who knows, who has experience terminating cover crops. If your retailer that you're working with is new to it, make sure that they're reaching out and talking to someone who has some experience. I think the next slide will reference, if you really want some more technical information, Purdue Extension has done a good job putting out some technical documents. They have 2 documents. They have one that is just specific about terminating annual ryegrass, and another one that just covers more broadly terminating cover crops. I would reference those if you want more information, and they will give you a little more technical information as far as rates, pH, that type of thing, to make sure that you're doing the job well. Lastly, make sure that we're not relying on contact herbicides in the springtime for termination. Things such as gramoxone, or I don't doubt most people will be using Liberty this year, but things like that do just a lot of leaf burn and do not translocate to help kill the cover crop, and do not work well, especially on those cereals. You'll have some effect on the broadleafs, but we need to make sure that we're using something that can translocate to get a good effective kill. If we look beyond, there's the picture. So this is something that we do want to watch when it comes time to terminate our cover crops, that we don't have a lot of necrosis on the leaves. We can see this again if you have annual ryegrass. If you have a lot of maybe winter kill or winter burn on the top, it can be very delayed and kind of coming out from that growth. We just want to make sure that we're not spraying the herbicide too soon, and then we get a bunch of extra growth because it didn't translocate well. So make sure that your cover crops are growing out of these types of situations and have that good green leaf tissue before you go out and do those applications. Abigail, am I missing anything on the termination side of things? Because this is definitely something that we want to make sure we're hitting on.
No, I think you covered all the main points very well.
So as we look at non-chemical modes of termination, which we're really just going to kind of concentrate primarily on the roller crimper, which a lot of guys are going to when they're wanting to cut their herbicide use. They're really starting to push the use of the cereal rye, and it can be done with other cereals as well, but primarily cereal rye, to get some weed control benefits. So now we're talking about letting that cereal rye grow significantly more, and coming in, and you can see in this photo the benefits that we can have on this. This is a side-by-side field with the roller crimped on the left, so that rye was allowed to grow and knock down, and then that conventional no-till comparison on the right. So we can get a lot of good weed control. We do stress that we would want this knocked down. Some growers will let it go farther and still do a chemical termination, and then we'll talk about rolling that down a little bit later. but we can see some pretty good benefits out of the cereal rye. So the difference is a roller crimper is what's used here if you want to actually use termination. So on the left-hand side is a commercial roller crimper that has that chevron pattern. We need that rye to be past anthesis, so it gets knocked down, it gets crimped off. If you do it prior to anthesis or flowering, what you will get is that rye will tiller back out and start to regrow again from the base. That's why we want to make sure that we get to flowering. The downside of that system is that you're probably going to be putting planting back until, probably middle of May timeframe. By the time that you get that rye to get to anthesis, if the growers that are interested in doing this are paying a lot more attention to the variety of cereal rye that they have, so they're being sure to get a rye that will mature a little bit earlier so they can get out there sooner. They're also paying attention to their seeding rates. They're really upping the seeding rates, sometimes up into the 80 pounds per acre time frame, or pounds per acre, in order to get that big, thick biomass. So if you're interested in that, do some research on that, talk to the growers that have been using that system, but that is a actually crimping type system. The one in the middle is kind of a homemade system, pretty novel, pretty ingenious, just taking a cultipacker and welding some angle irons on there to get a good crimp involved. I think that grower ended up coming back and adding more bars across it the next year. He found that the bars in that picture weren't quite enough to do the job. Moving to the right, I don't know if we're going to get into this a little bit, but that is more of just a large land roller. So in that scenario, this is not termination, but it is kind of moving to our next topic in dealing with excessive biomass. If we end up having it, this field was chemically terminated, but in order to avoid that rye standing throughout the year, they came in with that large roller crimper and knocked that rye down. So that in this situation, it was corn, but even soybeans, so that it can avoid having to reach through that rye real thickly. Other methods of termination, obviously, if you have a winter kill, oats, radishes, things like that, you shouldn't have to come in and do termination. However, always scout your field, making sure that those brassicas in particular didn't overwinter. Rapeseed is being used quite a bit these days. It's not as reliable to winter kill as something like a radish or a turnip was. So we oftentimes see rapeseed coming through the winter and being there out in the springtime. So if you have a rapeseed and rye mix, for example, we want to make sure that we're adding, a 2,4-D or something to get that brassica and not just glyphosate. Glyphosate won't work really well on it. We also sometimes seed it. If you seeded your winter kill cover crops really late in the year, they may not germinate until springtime. And they may not germinate first thing in the spring. So that may be something that we need to keep an eye on. If you, for some reason, were out really late with those winter kill cover crops. Tillage, some guys will use tillage for termination methods. It is not something that I have a lot of experience with, or at least a lot of good experience with it. However, it can be done if the cover crops are small, or maybe, again, if you have like a legume cover crop, it's probably going to work out a lot better. So oftentimes we see growers, maybe they'll have a cereal cover crop ahead of corn. They'll think, well, the best thing to do is going to be to turn this under. Oftentimes that's kind of the worst thing to do, because now you've really infused that high biomass, high carbon to nitrogen ratio cereal underground, and it really sucks up a lot of that nitrogen really quick. So I would say use caution if you're looking at doing a cereal cover crop and wanting to do some tillage ahead of it. If it's really small, it's not going to cause too much of an issue. But just keep in mind that tillage isn't always the best method to get that done. I guess we should talk a little bit just on the growth stage too when we talk about termination. As I mentioned earlier, I really like that 18 to 24 inch height range for cereal rye. That's also a pretty good range in order for the chemicals to work really well. I like it because it'll break down over the course of the year. It gives me some weed control benefit. It doesn't give me a whole lot of issues with the plantability, but it's also, I think, a pretty good spot to get in there and get the chemicals applied and get good efficiency with your chemicals. So this slide, as we talk a little bit more about the rolling, we kind of brought that up in the last slide. So in 2019, we saw a lot of fields As a result of the really delayed planting, farmers that had cereal rye, a lot of them got really big. Okay, great, lot of biomass, that's good. Fortunately, most of them are soybean fields. That is a situation we talk about nitrogen management we'll want to get to, but we did see some advantage in rolling the rye down. I don't think I'm going to spend too much time on this looking at the time, but you can see where we did get an advantage so that the soybeans weren't trying to reach through that rye all year long, trying to see daylight. So that is something to consider. Again, it's only if the rye gets so big that it's not going to break down quickly. All right, so this will probably wrap up most of our time. We want to make sure we get through the nitrogen management. So this is extremely important, both in no-till situations for corn and strip-till situations in corn, but also in cover crop situations in corn. So first of all, we want to make a note between the difference between nitrogen concerns and allelopathy. Allelopathy is a thing. It is separate from nitrogen. Sometimes additional nitrogen can help overcome this. But the main keys with allelopathy, and we're talking, the concern here is corn planted into cereal rye. Soybeans into cereal rye, we don't see that issue with allelopathy, but cereal rye, one of the reasons it gives us good weed control and helps us is it does secrete chemicals, certain acids that help inhibit the growth of plants. And if it's not managed properly, that can hurt your corn crop as well. So if you're planting into cereal rye with corn, bottom line, do not plant within 10 days of termination. I'm not a fan of planting green into corn, but either plant green or wait 10 days after termination to plant. Make sure your planter is adjusted properly and that you're planting 2 inches deep and that you're closing the seed slot. That will avoid most issues with allelopathy. But as we look more to the nitrogen side of things, then we need to make sure that if we have corn going into a cover crop system, we need to make sure we're managing our nitrogen properly. So first, when we make the step to no-till, we need to understand that we're changing things in the system. When we do our cultivator pass in the springtime, we are essentially doing kind of a starter fertilizer application, because when we run that field cultivator, we are infusing oxygen into the system and we are causing organic matter to oxidize. So in the chart there, you can see the microbial activity in the blue. When it spikes, that's as a result of the spring tillage pass. The microbes go nuts, they digest all the carbon, they release a bunch of nitrogen, and then they kind of go to sleep for the rest of the year. In a no-till system, we don't see that spike because we're not doing that. We're not doing that tillage application. So we need to recognize that in a tillage system right away. We need to be thinking through our or in a no-till system, we need to think through our nitrogen application a little bit differently. And that's why we see things like starter nitrogen popular when growers switch to no-till or strip-till. Strip-till mitigates it a little bit because you're doing some tillage, but nonetheless, we still like to see those starter fertilizers involved. But then we throw a cover crop in the mix, because one of the things we want out of cover crops is nutrient loss reduction, right? We want to keep those nitrates in the field. We want to keep our fertilizer from leaving the field. Well, the downside to that is now we've taken up a lot of that available nitrogen early in the spring. And so we need to make sure that we're applying some upfront nitrogen to our corn crop. Again, this is, we're talking primarily about a corn crop, mostly into a cereal cover crop or annual ryegrass, but this can also apply to a legume cover crop. Legumes will use the nitrogen that is in the field first before they start creating their own. So we want to make sure that we're providing plenty of nitrogen to that corn seedling. So the ideal thing to be doing would be applying about 30 units banded with the planter. We do see the growers who are committed to cover crop systems are going to take that step to make these applications with their planter. If you do not have it on the planter, you're just starting off looking at some different systems. Maybe some growers will go out with a side dress bar ahead of time, or they'll go out with streamer nozzles and apply some UAN in order to put some nitrogen in that band. If we need to do an application, a broadcast application, we're probably looking at trying to, for example, if we can't do it with our planter, we're wanting to do 70 to 80 units broadcasted in some manner to make sure, and this is at planting, a side dress application is not going to come soon enough to overcome this issue. This needs to be done at or before planting. And, anhydrous, to me, for the most part, anhydrous is going to be too deep come springtime to really give much of a advantage for that seedling. So it needs to be something applied at planting time to help that seedling go. Abigail, I'll let you dive into the planting side of things and try to tie everything together. You got five
Yeah.
minutes.
I was gonna say, we're getting close on time here and there's so many things to touch on, but hopefully coming into now planting, just the key considerations when you're in the field, a lot of the concepts discussed before make sense. So when you look at a year like 2019, we know why fields that got away from being able to be terminated early needed to be waited to terminate after planting, because you had such an amount of biomass that planting green was really the greater situation to be in than letting it die close to planting, and you have a wet dead med out there that you're trying to plant into and encounter more problems. And so looking at the biomass that you're coming into in the spring, there's no getting terminated early, like Jim said, 10, 14 days before planting and getting it down is a good option, but trying to maximize soil health, especially on the soybean sides, being able to plant green is a great option as well and can be managed very successfully. And looking at the other soil health benefits all across the board, looking at your weed control, it can be a great option. And so knowing when to terminate and also your nitrogen management within these systems, these three will help you really become successful when you're in situations in the spring that we can't very well predict. And so planting green can look like this, and some farmers want this. Some farmers want to be planting into this type of scenario and have this much growth. But another way of planting green can also look like this. Like Jim said, his target of growth of not being too big, being in the vegetative stage. And then, this field I think was terminated right at planting. And so this was beans. Great scenario, being able to maximize that growth, in the spring when we're getting rains, it's being able to take the impact of the rainfall, keep soil on the ground, keep living roots for those microorganisms to thrive. And so it's a really great situation. And so planting green in soybeans is a great option. As we're looking at early planting dates, here's an example of one that was planted on April 6th. You can see here that planting was done timely, and then it wasn't able to be terminated until later in the month. And then this was 2020. We did get some cold, wet times when the beans weren't able to pop up out of the ground that quick, but essentially the residue breakdown by June, by September was almost completely turned over. And that's what we want to see. We want to see this great relationship between the residue and the soil and the cash crop. And this is what this is really accomplishing. And so here we have a planter setup of what you want to be looking at on the planter itself, getting great depth control, getting down pressure, getting with your row cleaners. Jim, if you want to cover like different openers or trash cleaners.
Yeah, so this will vary kind of the conditions and also where you are in your soil health journey, as you might say. So your soil will transition. It's important to keep that in mind. So sometimes we will see growers starting off with, I think the attachments and things like a coulter are much more important early on than maybe versus as they get farther down the line. Row cleaners will be kind of the most significant thing to consider, that if we have a lot of biomass out there, and it gets something like cereal rye gets large, or even some things like a hairy vetch or something like that, that the row cleaners can cause us some issues with wrapping. So again, earlier termination is going to avoid that issue. Anybody starting off, bottom line, don't be afraid to do some early termination. But there are situations where growers need to take off the row cleaners. Less of an issue if we have something like strip till or those skip row spaces like we had. And then, coulters, some of the guys who have been involved with no tilling for a long time are even kind of dropping their coulters and just making sure that they have a good disc opener. There's some different variations on that, but do make sure that you're adjusting your planter properly. That's the key to it. Take some time. Your conditions in a no-till, strip till, cover crop situation, they're just going to be different if you tend to be used to a conventional tilled bed. Make sure that the down pressure is there. I do not advocate for no-till corn right off the bat. Start off no-tilling soybeans, strip-tilling corn, because we want to avoid things such as seed slots, which we can see in this picture right now. This is a soybean field, so even where the cover crop side was, those soybeans do just fine in this scenario. There was plenty of growth, and in fact, there's plenty of moisture. We even saw a good response as far as the soybeans go, getting out of the ground better compared to that conventional tillage side of things. But in a corn situation, obviously that is not a good thing. We do not want to see that seed slotting for various reasons. And that is something that is more of an issue when you start the transition. So if you see your neighbor out there no tilling corn, but he's been doing it for 10, 15 years, think that you're going to go out and see those same situations the first year transitioning and trying out no-till and cover crops. Use the strip till if you're going to do something with the corn, or concentrate on just doing a cover crop ahead of soybeans for a couple of cycles first, and maybe just strip till corn without putting a cover crop in there. Avoid shallow seed planting. It's not a fair comparison with a cover crop or a no-till system if you're planting that seed shallow. Get out, make sure that the planter is doing its job. I know there's lots of controls in the cab, but let's make sure that it's doing what it should be doing.
And overall, just really encompassing, I threw this messy slide in at the end just to show there's so much we could touch base on. It's really important to go out and scout your fields. We know there can be pest issues. And so it is important as you're adapting this system that you're going out, walking fields. And really it's the physical differences that up front in the system of a soil health system that you can really start to notice. This wasn't a soil health talk. We could go on and on about the benefits of having those living roots, getting infiltration rates, water holding capacity, aggregate stability, really building. And that's the whole goal here. And hopefully these spring management considerations complement your system of really adapting right off the bat into a corn and soybean system that you can start to see the benefits. And then as you get comfortable, be able to play around it and figure out what best works in what year. So we really appreciate everyone for sticking on. Keep up to date with us as we're doing field days this summer, as we're running more through on our platform. I noticed, so we are at time, but hopefully if you have we can answer these questions. We do roll soybeans after they are emerged. They can be rolled up to V2 and V3 is what I've seen, and that's gone pretty well. And we can answer these questions on our other platform and get you those answers. And Claire, I think you have some wrap-up notes to add.
Yeah, thank you, Abigail and Jim, for that super informative presentation. It was definitely a jam-packed hour, but hopefully you all learned a few tips and tricks you can take with you as you gear up for planning here shortly. So I know we don't have much time left for questions, but I will encourage those with questions to feel free to reach out to Abigail or Jim directly. Their email addresses are right there on the screen, so snap a picture or write those down as needed. Or feel free to send us an email at ilsoy@ilsoy.org, and we are happy to connect you to them. So that concludes today's webinar on cover crops and spring management. Please take a few minutes after the webinar to answer our post-event survey. You can view the recording of today's presentation on the checkoff funded website, ilsoyadvisor.com. Thank you all for attending, and hope you have a great day.